slide presentation. I'm also trying PowerPoint subtitles for the first time, so hopefully that will work. Although I don't know for sure, so we'll see. Let's see. Okay. All right. So as Liat had mentioned, I'm at the Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And what I want to talk about are ways that humanities research is infused with aging research and ways that I personally have collaborated with humanities to think about new ways to explore questions regarding aging. I always like to mention a disclaimer that I personally am not a humanities scholar, but I do work with a lot of humanities scholars. And so I want to make sure that it's clear that I'm not speaking from a perspective.
I have a hard time hearing you. Is that my problem or is that a common problem?
No, we can hear very well, Kate.
Do other people have a problem or is it only my problem? Other people have a problem.
No, so no problem.
I don't know if it's your.
I can't hear you now.
Yeah, we hear you very bad. I think it's a problem in your computer because we heard very well.
I'll just go ahead and continue. Maybe there's a connection issue with Liat. Unless someone else is having trouble, and if someone else is having trouble, just let me know.
We hear you very bad. We hear you well.
You have that sound now?
Ooh. Yes, maybe it's because there is transcript that goes with it. Maybe that's the problem, that it's too heavy on the network or something. I was wondering if it's my problem or other people's problem, but.
And dismantle the subtitles and see if that helps.
No, it's, we hear you very, like with an echo or something. Maybe you can turn off your camera, or we can all turn off our cameras, and then there will be enough like bandwidth for the presentation, so we can view the presentation and hear you, but turn everything off, and then it might improve the quality of the line. I don't know.
All right, can you see the slides now? Video off?
There is something off with your sound, actually. It sounds with an echo. I don't know if mine is the same, but yours sounds like there is an echo that goes with it. And it wasn't before, actually. So there is something, I think, with the PowerPoint or something.
I actually think it was a problem with Zoom, because Zoom was receiving and sending sound over the same microphone. And I really think it would be better if Kate could go off Zoom and come back, because Zoom does these things sometimes. I think it was because of PowerPoint. but I think Zoom is not going to solve it unless we come back. She comes back into the connection.
Sure, so we can wait.
I'll sign off and come back on, and I won't on the captioning this time. And if PowerPoint's a problem, I won't use
Yeah, you sound like
We can't understand. Yeah. Yeah.
like you're an alien, right?
Underwater.
But it's first time it happened something like that, right?
Yes, yes. But I
But-
think it's because of the PowerPoint that she was
Yeah.
using. She was using the
But in fact, it was great. In fact, it was great that we could only, I just would like to say that it was great that not only person is speaking, but also you can read already.
Well, but if you have to make a choice between reading and hearing, then I prefer to at least hear her. So I think it
Yeah.
was too heavy for Zoom to use such a program.
I'm not sure, but we will see. Hope that she can connect now.
Yeah.
Okay, is
Good.
that better?
Yeah, much
So
better.
much better.
Okay, what I think, maybe I'll try not using the screen share, and I can always send the PowerPoint if you think that the PowerPoint's the issue.
Sure. I think it's, yeah, you can use the PowerPoint, but probably not the mode, the presentation mode that you're using, because with it,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, let me try it, and if that doesn't work, I'll shut off the PowerPoint. So I'll do the
Yes.
share screen, but if the echo's still there, I've turned off the subtitles.
Yeah, I think this was the problem.
Sorry, I've never used that before. I didn't realize that.
Well, it's such a cool mechanism, but it's just not working.
Apparently not cool enough.
Yes.
All right. So is that the sound okay now?
Perfect, perfect.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move forward then. So I was saying before that I am not a humanities scholar, but I work a lot with humanities scholars and bring a lot of humanities perspectives into my own research. So just to get everyone on the same page with the humanities and the field of gerontology, I thought I would start with differentiating a little bit between what gerontology is and some of the humanities-based approaches to studying age. As I'm sure you all know, gerontology is, of course, the study of later life, and it's broad and very inclusive of a lot of perspectives. It was a phrase that was coined in 1909 by Elie Mekhninoff, who also coined the phrase thanatology, and which I find interesting. And a lot of gerontology, but not all certainly, is based on either empirical research with testable hypotheses or qualitative in-depth understandings of things. So the questions I think that we ask in gerontology are often why or how. What does this look like? How does this operate? What can we do to fix it? Or what kinds of problems can we identify? And then what kinds of solutions can we propose? So it's very action oriented in many respects, in that the purpose is to make some kind of a change based on whatever approach one is using. So in-depth understanding of living alone, or looking at social determinants of health. I mean, you know, really, really broad and, like I say, inclusive of a lot of different perspectives. Somewhat in contrast then come some of these humanities perspectives. So right now there are three basic umbrellas of groups that have a slightly different take on those I don't want to say non-empirical, because there is empirical research involved, but a different way of looking at aging and thinking about the experiences of aging. Humanistic gerontology is one, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in depth. Humanistic gerontology, there's also a group of cultural gerontologists who really bridge more the social sciences and the humanities. And then there's this emerging field called age studies, or some people call it aging studies. And again, I'll get into those a little bit more. If anyone has a question or wants me to stop, also please just let me know and I can pause and elaborate or answer questions. I'm happy to discuss at the end, but please don't hesitate to stop if you want something clarified. And if I'm speaking too quickly, also please let me know. So humanistic gerontology, as many of these humanistic approaches or humanities-based, really comprises humanities as well as what I like to call interpretive social sciences. So sometimes there's a fine line between something like anthropology and whether it's considered a social science or more humanities-based, same with sociology, same with gerontology. So the questions, though, really define how the answers are approached. So when we think of gerontology and we think of the how and the why, in these approaches, the common thing is the question is, what does it mean? What does it mean and how did it get to mean that? So it's looking at not just the phenomenon, but how that phenomenon affects, a greater cultural understanding. And I know that sounds a lot like what we might say for gerontology, but I'll give some more examples that hopefully will make that a little bit clearer. Cultural gerontology, as I said, it draws from the social sciences and the humanities. And really the emphasis on cultural gerontology is placing that subjectivity within the lives of the person that you're studying. So it's making an epistolary stance of what is knowable and from what side is that knowable. So rather than looking from the outside in, it's really looking at the world from whatever group you're studying's subjective experience. And again, I think a lot of this sounds similar, but I'll give you some examples. And then age or aging studies really takes a perspective much like race studies do or gender studies. And the differentiation between the age and the aging studies is some folks think of age studies broadly to include, say, childhood studies or studies of middle age as well as late life. And other people focus strictly on later life. So they would tend to be under the umbrella of aging studies, but these are all fluid. These aren't hard, fast distinctions. But they want to look at, in aging studies, the way that discursive formations, social practices, and material conditions affect the experience of growing old. And again, I can say a little bit more about that in a bit. So if I, because I like seeing as, yes. Someone have a question?
Yes, I have a question. What about critical gerontology? It sounds a little bit like aging studies, no? I mean, it's kind of where would
I put critical gerontology? So initially, critical gerontology was under that umbrella of humanistic gerontology. So that was the Tom Coles and the Kathy Woodwards and the Martha Holstein back in the 70s and the 80s. And then that really branched into where you have the humanistic studies and the age studies folks who do a lot of crossover work. But I would say both sides would probably claim critical gerontology in different aspects of it. But really when it first emerged, with Minkler and Holstein and the only umbrella at that point was the humanistic gerontology umbrella. And then it kind of expanded. So it's kind of funny because again, these names make it seem like they're these hard, fast differences or they're these turf wars, and they're really not. I think it's just helpful, and some people can really align with the thinking that goes along with one group, even though the work might look similar, if that makes sense. I know, for example, Julia Twig's brilliant work in cultural gerontology would be very appropriate within the mainstream gerontology and within age studies. And the real defining thing, I think, is the kinds of questions that are asked. And as I mentioned earlier, this idea of gerontology, we tend to think of, the social sciences, biological sciences, some health sciences, social work, family sciences, not usually geriatrics, because that usually has a more clinical flair to it. But, those tend to be, and again, loosely tend to be the fields associated with gerontology, whereas, in humanities-based inquiry, we think of disciplines like literary studies, philosophy, history, media studies, those kinds of things. Just a brief history of the humanities and aging in the US. The Gerontological Society of America formed in 1945, shortly after World War II. And the inaugural issue of the GSA, which was the Journal of Gerontology at the time, came out in 1946. And so I'm going to show you some examples of some of the scholarship that were in that those early journals. It wasn't until the 70s, though, that the humanities and people in the humanities really started to embrace aging. And when I say this, I'm really only talking about very few people. I think arguably age is not a major topic in many branches of the humanities, but within gerontology, this became a really new way of looking at things. So GSA was the product of people looking at policy and a lot of biology and social structures such as retirement. So to come in and start thinking about other questions about, okay, we've got housing, we have health, we've got retirement, but what does it mean? What does it mean to be an older person? What's the historical legacy we've been given about how we should age? So those kinds of questions started to emerge. So GSA basically recognized this and started a subcommittee on the humanities. Later, it became a standing committee, and sadly now it's an advisory committee. So the humanities have always had a very, very precarious place within the organizations like GSA. However, in 2010, the Gerontologist, which is the flagship journal of the GSA, did formally create a mechanism for scholars in the humanities to publish. So there are now works that come into the Gerontologist that are strictly from a humanities perspective, which is really exciting. So giving some more scholarly credibility to the relationship between the humanities and the arts within GSA. So as I said, so when we say humanities, I find that this is surprisingly, I get into conversations with this a lot, especially since the humanities and arts are often lumped into one. So, I mean, the arts can be pretty clear. We think of dance, drawing, painting, theater, music, especially as the arts, but the humanities include those disciplines, literary studies, philosophy, history. Works I see that come into the Gerontologist, for example, might be an in-depth look at aging in the novels of Margaret Drabble, and what does that have to say about kind of the consciousness of society and thinking about things like end of life or caring for older persons, or Julian Barnes is The Lemon Table. What is that idea of mortality, and aging mean from a cultural context? Certainly philosophy, we have people like Jan Bars who writes about the meaning of time. And, what does it mean to be a mortal person in the, aging? Bioethics, again, we see, people writing about that. About things like, should we expend, scarce health care resources on older persons? What's the value of a life? Dementia, as a human rights, position. And then, of course, history. Some wonderful work by people like Andrew Ackenbaum and Tom Cole and Pat Thane and Lynn Battelliou about, how has age been thought about in the past? What were some of the prevailing views, and how have we inherited some of those, in our, current modern day? Tom Cole, for example, his wonderful book, The Journey of Life, really talks about some of the roots in Western Europe that really influence aging, in Western countries now. Things like intimacy at a distance as opposed to living with relatives, how myths have shaped some of our negative attitudes towards aging and things like that. But there are also all of these newer disciplines. So media studies, for example, has produced some really exciting things looking at film and aging and how we perceive older people, or even images that we, and confront, whether in advertising or other things, and how those might subtly play a role in our perspectives. Cultural studies, and many, many others. But again, looking at that, what does it mean versus the how? So this is just one of those great examples. I love going back to the early issues of the Journal of Gerontology because they're really, really fascinating. They cover a very large, swath of information, but they had, surprisingly, in this time with, when science was just really taking off in the science of aging, a lot of interesting things that involve the humanities. So this was just one perspective of Shakespeare on aging, and there are many others. You see this interesting trend then in that particular journal, and I'm sure in others, where when the 1960s come along and there's a big emphasis placed on statistics and statistical modeling, you see the humanities go away for a time, only to come back about 20 years later. So it's kind of started strong, then lost its place because of the emphasis on data and empirical research, and then hopefully, I like to think optimistically that it's being re-recognized for value that it can provide to the sciences hand in hand. So in this kind of early emergence in the 70s, David Van Tassel, and again, I'm focusing, I apologize, on the US, that's what I'm most familiar with. David Van Tassel received a large grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to have a conference on aging, which really started the whole humanities movement that we later saw in GSA, and some of the key figures even now in that movement started at this initial conference. And so the conference was Human Values in Aging, New Challenges in Research in the Humanities. Any of you who follow Rick Moody, know that he has a monthly newsletter called Human Values in the Humanities, or I think it's Human Values in Aging, that he still sends out through various listers, I think GSA, AARP, and a couple others. And so one of the questions that he really struggled with, Van Tassel, was this idea of the completion of being, that existential crisis of getting to that point of later life and wondering what's it all for. He wasn't asking questions of, is our goal in life just to be healthy? But we could imagine that those are questions that we have now when we think of successful aging and other things. So what's the point? Now, let's just say we make it to old age and we're healthy, and we've got good cognitive health, good physical health. What's the point? Where does the meaning in that come, and how do we look for that? This led to this really hallmark book also in 1978 that Kathy Woodward was a part of. So Kathy Woodward, who is a director of the Humanities Center at University of Washington now, is a major figure in the development of the humanities and aging. And I do point out that it does say elderly, and in the context of journals, I know in the US, elderly is now considered an inappropriate term because of the negative connotations and its marginalization. So I just want to point that out. But again, the idea being this, the experience and the materialistic experience that we can understand through the humanities. This is Tom's book. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. It really stemmed from his dissertation research, and really critical in helping us see things like the phrase "over the hill," and where that came from, thinking about how the stages of life have been looked at over time, and how that historical development of our views of the life course really have a major role in a lot of assumptions we have about aging. So that idea of life is a stage of rising and descending. We think of the, I don't have an image here, but you probably are all familiar with the stages of man or stages of a woman, where you have infancy on one end and late old age on the other, and it's like a hill. But once you hit middle age, then you're over that hill. And so that whole idea that once we hit middle age, we become less than, is something deeply ingrained in the histories of a lot of people. This is the Trynatsky's Old Age in the Old Regime is another great look at key philosophical and other historical points. And this came out in the late 80s. There are a couple others by McKee and others that take a great look at, philosophical writings about the meaning of age. So this is all kind of this great, golden period of humanities scholarship. And then, of course, George Minoir's book is one that's very widely cited, although a lot of, not without controversy, some people going back and revisiting some of the assumptions and the assertions in this and challenging them. But it's a great book if you want to look at things like, he includes gerontocracies and Sparta and, all kinds of interesting, facts and figures from historical contexts on aging. This is a personal favorite of mine, Andy Achenbaum's Crossing Frontiers. It's a very, very detailed look at the development of the science of aging. And so in contrast to the humanities, this book really makes the argument that the study of aging needed to separate itself from the humanities because it wanted to align itself with science, where the prestige and the power and the funding came from, that science had a gravitas or a certain kind of weight that the humanities didn't carry. And so, there was this impetus to really align deeply with the sciences and not so much with the humanities, which were considered not as, rigorous in the same sense. And then again, I mentioned Kathy Woodward. So Figuring Age is a really important compilation of humanities pieces. So people from cultural studies and other, more interpretive ways of thinking about how age is experienced in a culture, in a society. Now, this Margaret Goulet is a huge figure in the aging studies movement. So this book, Declining to Decline, takes that idea of that rising and descending staircase in the over the hill and says we can change that, and not that we can change the way we age physically, but we can change the way we allow ourselves to age culturally. So one great example is she talks about if you break your ankle when you're 60, then you're getting old. If you break your ankle when you're 30, then you're just busy. That we place these interpretations on events that lead to a narrative of decline, that we buy into this idea that we are declining and that we interpret our lives then in terms of this decline narrative, as opposed to what she suggests is a progress narrative. That again, not to ignore that we age, but we can think about how we talk about, interpret what it means to age. So this all brings me then to kind of the current state of age and aging studies and this humanities movement. In 2011, the first conference of the European Network of Aging Studies was held in Maastricht. And this was an attempt to bring in some of that idea of the critical turn and of critical gerontology that someone asked me about earlier, and to turn a lens on aging issues. So it was kind of reinvigorating the critical gerontology movement, bringing it under the fold of predominantly the folks there predominantly were humanities scholars. So again, history, philosophy, literary studies, theater studies, those kinds of folks. And it's still going strong. It's their conference the 2021 conference in Bucharest has been postponed to 2022, but the next ENOS conference will be in Bucharest in 2022. So I can send information on that to anyone who's interested. And this led then to the North American Network of Aging Studies, which came about in about 2013. So kind of the same thing, only focusing on bringing together scholars in North America, especially who look at aging from the humanities perspectives. All right, so that big prelude, I wanted to just set the stage to kind of explain not only humanities research on aging, but also how I infuse humanities-based perspectives into my own research and what that means. So some of the methods and meanings that I derive from that, and what I think that others can turn to the humanities potentially for their own work. So going back to the aging studies, the three things that the aging studies folks delineate as being important to their work is discursive formation, social practices, and material conditions. I find that as a social scientist coming into the humanities and trying to work with humanities scholars, language can be a real barrier. So, to me, discursive formations isn't intuitive, but really what they're talking about is the way that knowing is enacted. So whether it's through cultural artifacts like novels, or through power structures and things like conversations, or other ways that we use language or symbols to convey meaning. Same with film and other things. So the way that age is performed, I guess, and that how we, as people, interpret those performances and how those performances affect us. Also the social practices. So these cultural, spiritual, and other features that really define a group. So how is age not only performed, but practiced in real ways? And then material conditions. So what about the physical things like access to information, access to environments, how might those affect that idea of how we make meaning? So not just and I don't mean just, not say the social determinants of health or issues of environment that we might think about, but more on a psyche level of how does that affect how we're told that aging should be, links back to those discursive formations and those social practices. So I hope I can give some examples that might maybe make that a little clearer. Just some other examples of some ethical issues on aging, aging, meaning, and social structure. This is Jan Barr's bodies and gender and time. So, the kind of idea of how are aging bodies viewed? How are they portrayed? How are they represented in film? What are the barriers to aging bodies, especially women? So these are some of the questions that might come up, from a humanities perspective on aging. Contemporary narratives, so people taking a deep look at aging in novels, aging characters, and how those experiences relate to what's going on, in the world around us. So I want to turn then and just talk a little bit about some of the ways that I use humanistic components in my own work. And again, so my background's in English literature as an undergraduate, but I have a master's and a PhD in gerontology. And interestingly, I was fortunate that Tom Cole was one of my mentors in my master's program, but I also worked closely with the cognitive psychologist, Ruth O'Hara, who is from Stanford, to think about memory. My PhD mentor was an anthropologist, the late Robert Rubenstein. And then when I did a postdoc afterwards, I landed in a clinical setting with Kostas Laiketsos and Jason Brandt as my mentors. And there we were doing clinical research on Alzheimer's and other dementias. I was doing it within the context of a large facility where there were 167 people living with dementia, advanced stages. And so that kind of set the stage for all of these things coming together and really formed the way that I look at the humanities and using the humanities in my own work. So first of all, my perspective, primary perspective is narrative gerontology. And by that, I mean the ways that we make experience known through stories. So those stories can be personal stories, life stories, they can be histories, they can be, small stories told in conversation. But I'm really interested in things like what stories get to be told about aging. If you asked an older person to tell the story of their life, it comes with a prescribed plot, at least in the US, of generally, I was born here, I went to school here, I married so-and-so if they married, and then I got this job, and then some, complicating action happens, and then here I am today, and, I wouldn't trade anything for the world. So they're the very, very prescribed plots that come into play, these master narratives. So I was really interested in how can we get beyond that to understand layers of aging through different ways that we can use talk and use stories. So that kind of is a formation of this narrative gerontology. I was able then to link that with, I mentioned Ruth O'Hara, who helped me in my master's look at how to analyze some of this from a more social science perspective. So I took a look at how writing about aging and grammatical complexity and idea density was used in the Nunn study, David Snowden's Nunn study with Ruth Kemper as a social linguist, how we can learn about memory and how does recalling stories from our life affect our memory performance. So kind of linked that idea of stories as an important aspect in who we are to do stories have an effect on our memory. And I carried that farther in some later work that I had funded from our National Institutes of Health, doing a clinical trial to say, okay, we've got stories, but do telling stories affect us differently than writing stories down? Does actively thinking and writing about something from your past help your memory in a way that telling a story just off the cuff doesn't? And the bottom line is, I didn't find any major difference except in people's concept of self. So when I use these standardized instruments in the context of a story writing group and a storytelling group, I didn't find changes in memory per se, but I did find that people's sense of self changed dramatically in the story writing group because I would argue that it gave people a chance to be introspective and and think about resolving things from their past or reliving things from their past. And it did that in a different way than it did for the oral reminiscence group. So then kind of fast forward, then thinking about the experience of dementia, one thing that became clear in working very closely with people living with dementia is that there are a lot of things that happen in a person's daily life that can't be measured or that don't lend themselves to measurement. Yet when we look at the research about things like the arts and dementia or even things like storytelling, the number one critique is always, but we can't measure it. It doesn't have a discernible difference. Is it really worth spending money on? And so I've been working with Ann Bastine, from the founder of Time Slips, to think about what can we say about what counts, in dementia care? How can we quantify meaning? I don't mean how, but why should we quantify meaning? Is meaning enough in its own sake, or do we need to put things through the rigor of a clinical trial when the outcome is a better human existence, whatever that means? And it really comes around this idea of value. All of that linking back to the idea of these are the questions that you would ask from the humanities, not necessarily the social sciences or the clinical sciences. What does it mean to have a good life? What does it mean to have a good moment? I also worked with a literary scholar from the Netherlands to look at play. And so we took the Dutch historian Huizinga's notion of play. So the Homo Ludens where Huizinga argues that the real aspect of being human is play. It's not to be the knower, it's to be the player. And so we thought deeply about that in that historical context and what is play, how do we see it? And then we took that to look at some interventions in some Dutch nursing homes. One was a poetry program and one was a time slips program. And we weren't interested, say, in things like cognition or behaviors or things like that, but we were interested in seeing what do people do when they play and what does playing with language mean? And how might that affect the greater community? So again, those ideas of meaningfulness more so than, you know, looking at a clinical outcome, that sort of thing. And then more recently, looking at how the stories people tell about themselves. So this is in the context of research on understanding underrepresented persons in Ohio, older persons. And we were actually interested in their attitudes towards long-term care, but what ended up coming through these conversations was this notion of place. So, you know, we differentiate between big stories or like the grand story or your life story, and small stories are those little snippets of talk that come up that aren't really necessarily related to the main topic, but a little aside here, that kind of thing. And what we found is there were a lot of these asides where people talked about place. You know, they would say things like, well, let me tell you a story here. You know, this is how I learned how to be who I am. A lot of it regarding, you know, race, racial discrimination, knowing your place, being taught your place, feeling out of place. So going back again to those notions of what can we learn, you know, through something like the simple act of listening to a person's story about their experience. And my co-author, Gwen Etter-Lewis, is she's a professor of English at Miami and a sociolinguist in the department. So currently I'm working with Tom Cole and a literature professor from Toronto, Marlene Goldman, and we're doing the 4th edition of the Guide to Humanistic Studies in Aging. And so what we decided to do here, so this is where I see the state of things. I see that the humanities scholars tend to, you know, be on one side and the social science people are on another side, and rarely do the two actually meet to talk. I think that's for several reasons. I think the languages that we use in our disciplines make it very difficult to cross borders. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what our goals are and what our, you know, what our mutual, you know, interests might be. And I think there's also the very basic thing of what do I do with this? You know, what do I do with this idea if it's not testable, or I don't care about testing things. What do I do with the knowledge about, you know, social determinants of health? So what we decided to do is we have humanities scholars writing chapters from their perspective, deeply embedded in their, you know, disciplines. And then we're having a social scientist take up that chapter and try to think about how that might be related to their own work. And I gotta say, it's been wonderful and horrible at the same time. I am often on the phone with especially, you know, the social scientists that I work with, where they're saying, I have no idea what this chapter says. What am I supposed to do with this? And, you know, kind of taking those moments then to talk through what are the key elements? How can we take some of these really important ideas that the humanities people are writing about, but bring it back to the work so that we can ask, as social scientists, different kinds of questions that might help us better understand aging. So I'll let you know how that turns out. Our manuscript is due in a couple months. So far, so good. So it should be a really interesting way of trying to bridge these two perspectives. And so, you know, these are the questions then that I'm really left with is how can we foster some more collaborative conversations so that it's not an us and them, but it's how, you know, life is complicated. How can we think about not only those things that we can measure or study, but those things that involve meaning that we get at in a very different way than we would, say, looking at a correlation between, you know, a couple things. You know, how can we bridge those languages of disciplines so that we can talk to each other? We have, so often use the same words for things and mean very different things. How can we get beyond that to open ourselves up to think more broadly, not to give up our perspectives, but to allow ourselves to be sensitive to new ways of thinking. And again, how do we do this with the goal of adding to what we do without taking away? So I'm not suggesting that a humanities scholar should be less humanities and more social science and vice versa, but retain what it is, what you do, and just add this other bridge of being able to, to work with others to think of new ways of thinking. So with that, I welcome any kinds of questions or discussion. Again, I just thank you for having me here today, and I will go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your talk, and I think that now it's open for discussions and questions if people have any. Feel free to jump in and ask. Well, I was looking at Smadara and I said, I'm looking at Smadara and I know that she has a question. So if she's not jumping in, I will ask for her. So go ahead, Smadara.
I wanted to say, first of all, it was very, very interesting. I think that thanks to your lecture now, I will read and watch in different lenses concerning aging and how do arts or humanities, as you described it, reflects different perspectives on aging or meanings of aging. I don't know if this is what Liat meant, but I would like to investigate in my PhD the meaning of living without children in Israel, which is from what I've heard, I think that's why I asked about critical gerontology, because I think it fits also cultural gerontology, also aging studies, because Israel is a very, very familiar society, and older adults without children in Israel are considered a minority and even a privileged population, because it's a society that really, really encourages and puts emphasis on having children and family. And I was wondering with you how, under which category would you focus that, or under which theoretical paradigm? I mean, how would you define it, under which category? Because it all fits. Maybe it's a little bit difficult to understand the differences between the different, but I think I did understand. I mean, I think you explained it very well. But this is my interest.
I think that's a great question and a great topic, because you can think of it from a lot of different perspectives. I mean, if you think culturally, and by culturally, I mean, historically, and, and you look at how people without children are viewed, I know, if you look at fairy tales, for example, and you look at women without children, they're witches. There's something unnatural about not wanting children, and that's kind of the legacy that we inherit. And so, I think you could take this from, a lot of different perspectives. There's this assumption about older people that they're all benevolent grandparents. And so when you don't meet that, don't fit that box of being a grandparent, then you're somehow deviant or less than, or, those attitudes, especially for women. I think it hits women differently than men. So you could look at it embedded in the culture. You could look at even, the images that you're shown about, how to have a good old age. You're an older, heterosexual, long-time married couple, surrounded and basking in the joy of your children and grandchildren, and those are the images that, many of us are confronted with. So, I mean, you could look at it visually, from film, from culture. I think there's a lot of ways that you could take that. And so I don't know that one perspective is that you need to settle on one, but I would think, if you really honed in on your, what it is that you want to reveal about the experience of being an older person without children, do you want to think about the way that society frames your experience, the way you've been culturally taught to, have these goals, I think it could go a lot of different ways, but there's a really active Twitter group on aging without children also, that I don't know if you are on Twitter, but I see a lot of things posted. Yeah.
Okay, so I will look it up. Thank you so much.
If I could just say something and ask you for a little bit more information. Kate, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much. And I am fascinated by one of the articles. And if you could share more details on it, I would love to hear more about it. I am fascinated with how you use the Homo ludens and play with people with dementia. And I'm personally very interested in that as well, and how we can promote joy and happy moments and make them reconnect with themselves. So if you could expand a little bit on it, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, that was a really interesting project, working with my colleague Ahia. And so what we did is we did a deep reading of Huizinga's Homo Ludens to find out, so what, according to him, are the components of play. And it's the voluntariness of it. It's the not having an end goal, which was really important. And also that play isn't always positive, that you don't have to always have fun when you play. You can have, bad things happen. And so, of course, a lot of this is in the context of children, and it becomes apparent. But we kind of took that and thought, okay, what are these criteria? Or we didn't use criteria, but what are these main ideas? And then we started looking at the literature, and we found that a lot of times there is an end goal when you use arts or kind of interactive events with older persons. So you produce something, it's almost like you have to demonstrate that you did something. You have a painting, you have a story, you have and that the emphasis then is on the production and not on the journey of the production. And so we felt that that was a problem, that if we're only going to say, oh, look, isn't this nice? People made a painting. And that's missing the whole point. The other thing is games. So it's not games, because games have rules and a desired outcome. And so, this idea of fluid rules became important too. So, in our observations, then the neat thing, and I'm happy to send you the paper, the neat thing is you could see people so there's this Alzheimer's Poetry Project. Gary Glazner in Brooklyn has this wonderful program. So when Ahia is doing this with the people that she's working with, what ends up happening is there's a lot of silliness that goes on. And then this play kind of starts as within the social group itself. So you have a group of people that the staff really don't think are capable of much, especially talking to each other, communicating. But suddenly you're bringing out these new ways of engaging. And then people started teasing each other, pleasantly. So I guess different accents in the area of the Netherlands she was at. So I guess it depended if you had, different dialects. And people would start mimicking those, and they would start remembering things about other people. And it just became this context for this whole other type of community to develop within, based on this, this introduction of something that allowed folks to not work towards that goal. I mean, it was really neat. But the problem then becomes, or not the problem, a challenge then is like, then just making the argument for that's good enough, that it doesn't matter. You're not going to, reverse a deteriorating condition. People aren't going to get better health-wise, but wouldn't all of us want to have 10 good minutes as opposed to nothing? Wouldn't that be isn't that in and of itself worth it? So that's kind of the perspective that we were taking. But I'm happy to send that to you if you like.
I would love to discuss more with you, but I don't want to, to take over the discussion. So other people can talk. And I'll be in touch later. Thank you.
So if other people have any questions, feel free, or comments. Yes, Sylvia.
Thank you, Liat, and thank you so much, Kate. I found your presentation fascinating. I also feel very connected as a person that with a BA in theater and then a master's on interprofessional practice in health. So I do relate. My question, and now dealing with human rights. So I was wondering whether you also bring into this new work that you're doing, interdisciplinary work, do you bring also the perspective of human rights into the mix?
I haven't personally yet, but I am working with a group of bioethicists, and we're looking at cultural narratives of dementia, and and definitely adding a human rights element in that. There's another book on dementia. It's called Dementia as Human Rights, and trying to make the argument that people living with a form of dementia are often not appreciated fully as people entitled to human rights. Things like, having, autonomy in a true sense of not being limited to, being treated as a body to be cared for. So I haven't delved into that myself yet, but I am working with a group of people. We've submitted a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to kind of bring more of that element in. I think it's an area that's really lacking and really would benefit from, people who do work in human rights to really take an eye, toward, aging in general, but especially people living with dementia.
Thank you. I'll be back to you. I'll be in touch.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to comment or question? Well, so thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and especially Kate for giving such an inspiring talk. Thank you.
Thank you again for having me, and thank you for all listening. And if anyone would like to contact me for more information, I welcome that and would be happy to send whatever or help in any way I can.
Thank you. It's been really inspiring. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.